what we are seeing in real time is a shift from, I think, what I would term as co-driving into agentic. Even for very challenging, sophisticated software engineering work inside of Google, which has an enormous repo with very sophisticated dependencies, you are starting to see a model where you can treat it as an agent. And for me, the distinction with an agent is I will assign work to this thing and I'm really not going to watch it, which is a very different paradigm than co-driving, because basically when the agent has done its work, you're paying this cost to even absorb or download the state of where the agent finished and to even understand what it tried to do and then how to correct what it did.
That was Nicholas Moy, former head of research at Windsurf and now at Google DeepMind, on the shift from AI co-driving to a truly agentic era of software development. Such a take may be somewhat obvious to people on the bleeding edge of using and/or building AI-assisted coding systems, but the world has bifurcated. Many are still maxing out on AI code completion and not realizing that tools such as Google Anti-Gravity can even abstract away your coding environment. Your AI agent can go away and build software for tens of minutes, and your job becomes focusing on software systems and product in addition to reviewing AI pull requests. May you live in interesting times indeed. In this episode, Nick, Duncan and I explore the engineering discipline required to build at the frontier of AI-powered coding. We discuss Windsurf's journey and the strategic necessity of disrupting yourself to avoid the innovator's dilemma. Nick shares his framework for building resilient software by focusing on what he calls information invariance. These are the core data requirements that remain constant even as underlying models improve exponentially. We dive into the technical challenges of the agentic paradigm, including the double penalty of agentic failure and why the primary developer interface is shifting from the IDE to review-centric workflows. We also cover the unique value of capturing fuzzy human data and the strategy of swagging future capabilities to stay ahead of the next frontier model checkpoint. This was a really fun conversation about how the most sophisticated teams are navigating the transition from real-time assistance to autonomous agents. If you enjoy these conversations, please leave us a review, give us 5 stars, subscribe to the newsletter, and share it with your friends. Links are in the show notes. I'm Hugo Bown-Anderson, and welcome to High Signal. Let's jump in. Hey there, Nick, and welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
So exciting to have you here. There are so many things you've been working on and thinking about that I think I'm very excited about, but our audience will be super interested in, not least of all, what it was like to build Windsurf and now everything you're doing at DeepMind. So I'm just wondering if you could walk us through the journey of building Windsurf, from what the initial vision was and how you had to pivot and evolve as what we've seen with model development, frontier model development, dramatically changing this year.
Yeah, it's really just been a roller coaster over the last 3 years. And I'm happy to start from the beginning. I'm going to take you guys back. Imagine a time before time when it was like GPT 3.5. It was AI. The state of the art for AI was just autocomplete. It was like tab, like finish your sentence. And that already felt like magic. And that was like a setting in which I joined as a pretty early engineer at Windsurf, which was at the time called Codeium. And at that time, almost as soon as I joined, I think we prototyped, we were trying out this notion that would later become very popular of this agentic coding agent that was going to take multiple steps on your behalf and make really big changes. But at that time, as you can imagine, it was just didn't feel right. Compounding errors, it would just always go veer off in the wrong direction or stop too early or whatever. And I remember we would just periodically go back. We would try again with GPT-4, the original GPT-4, not 4.0, not any of the other checkpoints. And it still wasn't right. So basically, the decision was we should try to ship something and have it be useful, not just wait for a future in which this dream that we have is going to happen. So we focused on the autocomplete product. We tried to make autocomplete really good. We were trying to sell something against, to be honest, a very strong incumbent, which was Copilot at that time, and really emphasized features that we could have control over other than the model, which was self-hosting, on-prem, huge investment in things like dedicated context and context retrieval and context engineering. I think the whole time we were always dreaming of when can we go back to that vision for the future? And so I think this is not maybe unique. A lot of people were probably working at the same time, but I think we were probably one of the first to ultimately ship an agentic coding product and feature. That was Windsurf. And that was around, I think, late October, early November of last year, 2024. And it was crazy successful. I think it was beyond our expectations. I remember when we launched, I went away for the weekend with my wife to New Mexico, and I was trying to turn off the notifications. And then I was on the email alert list for Anthropic for like our billing. And we would get a bill like every $1,000 that we spent. And I could literally see like an exponential curve in my email inbox because I would just get pings more and more frequently, like through the course of a day. That launch went really well. And then the immediate question we had after is like, what can we do else after that? And I think the big thing that we set out to do after was like, okay, we have this unique advantage relative to a model company, which is we have this real usage data. Can we demonstrate the data flywheel? Can we demonstrate, or do a proof of concept that there's really something valuable you can get out of real users interacting with your model in a real kind of problem setting? And so we set out to try to train a model of our own. I think we released a frontier level model produced by an agent lab company that was SWE1, that was in May. And I think a number of other agent lab companies have since followed suit. But this was Claude 3.5 level at a time when I think Claude 3.7 was state of the art. So that was basically May of last year. And then as of last summer, basically a lot of the core research and development team basically joined Google DeepMind. And that's where we are now. That's where I am now, and working on basically making Gemini feel better for software engineers use cases.
It's so cool to hear, Nick. And building a startup in this space today means your technology can so quickly be leapfrogged by competitors almost overnight. And I think this creates an almost innovator's dilemma where you have to be constantly reinventing yourself, as you called out. Was there like a specific moment or particular kind of model release where you've realized like, wow, this needs to change right now?
Yes, I think so. I actually remember very vividly that day. So as I said, the whole time we were building the autocomplete business out and trying to sell and like trying to get adoption for that business, we were always dreaming of like, what's next? Because I think maybe one key way to avoid the innovator's dilemma is you don't look at yourself as the thing that is making you a lot of money today. If you are always perceiving yourself as, we are not the tab autocomplete company, we are the AI-powered software generation company, you're always just impatient for what the next thing is. So we're always in the back burner, have this agentic coding framework prototype that's like kind of cooking, and we're testing a lot of stuff. And I remember the day that we were finally like, we've been hearing some good things about Claude, and let's just plug that into our harness, and changing nothing else, literally just being able to like sample from the Claude API. It was like, whoa, this thing is ready. And basically, I think we shipped Windsurf a month later. That's the kind of moment that we were waiting for. So in a way, it's almost like preparing to disrupt yourself. And then finally, when the opportunity arrives, you're like ready to go.
This is actually so important because a conversation we had with Lance Martin from LangChain about this, he really made sure that people went away understanding this as well. That we're at a stage where if you have an idea and your product doesn't seem to work, there may be a model release tomorrow which allows it to work. And that seems something relative, like sure, technological change can make new ideas possible, but it hasn't been at this cadence or with the release of new models historically.
Yeah, absolutely. And in fact, I would say it's only been a year, but like I feel that the pace of meaningful kind of new model releases that are meaningfully superior in capability to the previous one has actually only accelerated. So it's even less time than you have to wait. I think we did wait about a year for the models to catch up to good enough. But I think now, if you have a vision for the future that you don't have right now, it's very possible like in 2 months or 3 months, suddenly a product feature that didn't make any sense is going to make a lot of sense.
I know Duncan has a very interesting question for developers around engineering and product challenges. But before that, I do want to ask, what does this mean for even the concept of a defensible moat? And how did you think about that at Windsurf? It seems like moats are increasingly challenging.
Yeah, I think it's not easy. And what I would say is, I used to work in finance, and I actually started to think of this a lot. There's like a portfolio management strategy with managing a startup. And I think like any portfolio, you decide for yourself what your risk reward profile is going to be, but then you got to balance basically the sets of investments that you make. Long-term, short-term kind of local product features, making yourself robust to the future. And there are basically different companies will come out with different strategies for how they want to deal with this. And there were many companies in our vintage that basically went all the way towards, we're just going to go to the finish line. We're going to build either like this something that only makes sense when the agents are basically capable of running for hours and hours by themselves, or we're going to go straight to training a foundation model end to end. And we think that's going to be a moat. And I think what we took is probably a more cautious approach, which was like, we're going to try to build for today because there's a lot of kind of benefits to that where you get like kind of a user-based adoption, some brand recognition, and probably most importantly, like a really strong intuition for what the frontier is and what your customers want from you and what they're trying to do from you. And that's like surprisingly kind of valuable and interesting. And I think like many of the strongest AI companies Now that you look out there like Cursor or what have you, that's a lot of what they rely on, that and staying on their toes. They're probably always a little bit ahead informationally than anyone else behind them. Never mind the fact that they have then ability to build reputation and build a recruiting pipeline and build a lot more things become easy when you have something in the market that you can feed back to your investors, your customers, your potential hires, your current hires towards. So that was the strategy that we took. And I think that worked really well for us. I think probably that's my bias, but I would say if I were a startup and I were imagining a future, you can always try to dream up a technical moat for yourself or some kind of like long-term defensible moat. But I would say that it's almost never a bad idea to like try to get something in market and try to get real users. Especially if you believe that something you're not forcing that feature out. You think it's a good feature. You think it will like really meaningfully tell you something about where the thing is going to go in the future. That's very valuable to get into the market and get people to really start to recognize you. I don't know if that's a satisfying answer. It is very dicey out there for any kind of AI-powered application startup, but I think that there's plenty of businesses out there that seem to be able to use that lead to consistently maintain that lead and consistently build kind of enterprise value over time. And time will tell what happens there.
Do you think there, Nick, the value of building in public has changed in the AI era, like along those lines? That you need to be just like constantly talking about what you're doing and being really transparent about it so that you can create that flywheel?
Yeah, I think so. One idea that I was thinking about is this notion that with AI, it's so like positive sum, and it's very weird to operate in a substrate where whatever the market opportunity that's in front of you today, you could just almost underwrite that it'll be at least like 2 to 4x bigger next year just by virtue of these things are going to be more capable. And so no one idea is so precious that you have to be so protective and private about it because there's a kind of another round to play. And so in that environment, I think there's asymmetric returns to move fast, kind of ship something early, see if it resonates, see if it actually works. And that's leading more towards maybe a lot of teams kind of shipping things in public. And it's so much easier to get to like, there is an aha here. It may be more of a niche than maybe a lot of the common use cases get snapped up earlier and earlier. But like, it's way easier to ship something that is like materially useful for some people now. And in some ways, I feel like that's a really helpful way to get the flywheel moving.
I think Anthropic is a wonderful example of this in terms of building in public, dog fooding, while also helping the community so much. And I do think in the limit where it's not clear besides data what a moat can be, switching costs are very low for all of us, right? Actual community building and goodwill and helping people has returned to be something incredibly important.
Yeah, and that too, I think it also, reputationally, I think there's like that HR report that's Anthropic by far has the highest retention rate of their people. I think like when you really stand for something, you really represent, you have a value system, it's very clear. And maybe you turn some set of people off, I don't know, but like for the people that you resonate with, it's like very, very, that's another way to create loyalty. And we haven't talked about like the importance of having a talent, but like attracting talent in this space is insanely difficult. And maybe that's another way that you create a moat is actually like in your ability to have this group of people that are real. I think Brian Chesky used that word like missionaries, not mercenaries, like that are real missionaries for what you were trying to build and they really believe in either the mission of the company or the culture or the values of that company. I think that is manifestly true and very consistent in the behavior of some companies like Anthropic, maybe among others, that I think they are, what they say that they are. And I think that kind of does pay them dividends over time.
Super cool. Let's shift gears a little bit and curious to talk more about like the product and engineering side. And in particular, how you thought about the kind of most important product engineering challenges you had to solve when you're building an AI-driven assistant. And maybe like what's something you learned there that would surprise people?
Yeah, I don't know about surprise. And there's so many lessons. But I think maybe the one that's the kind of the most new to me is like this challenge of writing software that's still useful in 6 months when the product might be completely different. Like, how do you avoid writing a feature and then throwing it out in 3 months because like your AI is way more capable than it used to be before? And one thing I think I'm really proud of with Windsurf is over the last 18 months, a lot of our core agentic framework has basically been the same. And this is like really going back to way before, I think agentic was even a word that was really used in product development. I don't even think we had that word in our vocabulary. We were using another word for it. But like the data representations that we had, the way that we orchestrated the loop, the way that we mapped them. Again, I don't even think we had tool calling at that time in the API. So the way that we mapped it to like functionality, and in addition, like the data flywheel, so the eval infrastructure, the training infrastructure, the data processing infrastructure. Like one thing I think is interesting is without realizing it, we were multi-step RL compatible sort of 18 months ago, when I think that was only a word that was being explored inside of the frontier AI labs, and in a very experimental way in some of these AI labs. So I think that's probably a little bit of luck, maybe a little bit of insight. How do you do that? I think it's like you try to keep a very kind of close eye on, this is where I'm trying to go, and here are the invariants for where I'm trying to go. So what are the invariants of the problem that you're trying to solve? And I think the way that we used to think about this is, what's the work that we're ultimately trying to enable the AI to achieve if we were to project like 10, 15, 20 years in the future? And what will always be true about having to do that work? So for example, like common invariants would be like information invariants. There's fundamentally no way to accomplish this task unless you have this kind of source of information. Or like output invariants, like ultimately, like you need to produce work, and that work is like always going to take this form in this industry. That's what it's going to look like. So like you have some understanding of, these are things that we can invest over a 3-year horizon for. And then almost anything else is, you just got to treat it as if you might have to throw it all away. And I think that's a kind of delicate balance, and like knowing the difference is really hard. And I think many things in retrospect, like we made the wrong call on a lot of things. But in aggregate, can you like consistently string together good decision making around what is going to be there in 2 years and what's something that you should wait and see how much you should invest in? I think that turns out to be really challenging and really rewarding if you can get it right.
Super interesting. I'm really interested in the spread or the variance of how developers use AI. So a couple of years ago, a lot of us were copying and pasting from our IDE to ChatGPT or whatever it may be, sometimes taking screenshots. And of course, one of the jokes was it was very good at a lot of APIs, wasn't particularly good at its own API. And I still know people who do that, right? Then we have auto-completion. And now, of course, we have agents embedded in our IDEs where they're writing code. We also have agents embedded in CI/CD, the rise of ambient and background agents. So there are so many levels to how we can use these amazing things. I'm just wondering how you've seen user behavior evolve from vibe coding to what, for lack of a better term, we'd now call agentic software engineering.
Yeah. So I do think basically what we are seeing in real time is a shift from, I think, what I would term as co-driving into like agentic. And so I think co-driving sort of means like, I am still sitting, like you're doing this, but I'm sitting there watching more or less the files that you open or the thoughts that are going through your head, the edits that you're making. And in real time, I might have to do a course correction. And then it's slightly less than real time. Maybe every 3 minutes, I need to course correct you or reprompt you or something like that. That's kind of the state that we're in right now. I think obviously if you compare that to 2 years ago, it feels like night and day. If before it was literally, I am driving, and you every once in a while will like autocomplete, so you'll nudge me back in the right direction. But I think it's pretty clear now that even for very challenging work, even for very challenging, sophisticated software engineering work inside of Google, which has an enormous repo with very sophisticated dependencies, you are starting to see a model where you can actually you can treat it as an agent. And for me, the distinction with an agent is I will assign work to this thing, and I'm really not going to watch it, which is a very different paradigm than co-driving, because like basically when the agent has done its work, you're paying this cost to even absorb or download the state of where the agent finished and like to even understand. So it requires a lot more trust to allocate work to the agent, because if the agent does something wrong, you basically have to pay a double penalty because you have to understand what it even tried to do and then how to correct what it did. And it's almost not worth the effort. And I think that threshold is, the models are just about reaching the intelligence where that is really going to become the norm, where you can trust them to get it roughly right more times often than not. And more importantly, you can also trust them to explain their work and walk through their work and basically lower the cost for you of understanding what they did. And in the similar way that a pretty good engineer will write a nice, helpful PR description with pointers and screenshots and documenting what they did. I think with a lot of the products now, you're seeing that kind of self-explanation, and that helps a lot with the agentic mode. So that barrier is really coming down. The models are getting smarter. You're really going to start to see people really just treat these as things that I will fire off and come and check back in on them maybe an hour later, or maybe in not too distant future, like days later.
They're getting so much smarter, and I'm very happy to stand corrected. I was less bullish on the model's abilities to do unguided or less supervised agentic stuff early this year, particularly in the last 6 months with models such as last month or with models such as Gemini 3. And congrats on Flash, by the way, as well. But even the ability of the newer models to do like a series of tool calls correctly and plan the tool calls, that's something that I'm incredibly impressed and surprised by. And I am wondering, I'm not quite asking you to predict the future. Having said that, we do work in machine learning, but like a possible trajectory here is we don't even read a lot of the code soon, right? Like we look at pull requests and maybe a couple of dashboards and agent-written descriptions and this type of stuff. Of course, with very high-risk stuff, you want to make sure you have human eyes on that. But I'm just wondering your thoughts on what the future evolution could be.
Yeah, I think pull request is a nice analogy for this. And I think that will increasingly, maybe for better or worse, depending on, many engineers may be dismayed at this. This may be like the primary surface at which you interact with and supervise agentic work for the foreseeable future, because there's a kind of a pretty wide spectrum in that space. Again, if you're talking about, if I gave a review to a very experienced engineer, I might not even look that closely at the code. But maybe right now the agents are quite a little bit less than a very experienced engineer, so I would look more closely. But they're already in that ballpark, in that kind of spectrum.
You wouldn't look at it in an editor as well, right? And that's part of like, I think we're still like agent and editor. And I think that the paradigm may shift away from that a lot.
You're absolutely right. I think that's a big part of why Anti-Gravity, the product we just shipped, it's front and center is this mode where agent manager mode, where you don't see an editor at all. You only see kind of self-surfaced artifacts that the model is choosing to present to you to highlight or summarize the work that it's done. And importantly, I think it's like the steps that I've taken to verify this work. Here's a screen recording of my testing of the UI, or here's a unit test with some log, a pointer to some logs that I ran the unit test and confirmed that this thing works. I think that increasingly will be a surface where most of the review happens, and you only double click when you have some suspicion that something is going wrong.
We talked a little bit earlier about the data flywheel and the need to gather more customer feedback, but would be interested to maybe tease that out a little bit more from like a strategic perspective, and not only how does it enable you to go faster today, but how you might think about like the strategic need to build data flywheels into any given AI product so that you can develop faster, learn faster, maybe train your own models or fine-tune models. Like curious about how you've seen that play out and how you think that may play out in the future.
Yeah, I think the calculus around this is evolving in real time. At the time that we started, there were no startups really credibly able to produce training data with the realism of kind of environment for the tasks that I can think we were anticipating doing. And I think in that world, it just seems so clear. If nothing else, we can like basically produce this massive volume and then license it or commercialize it, which I think some of these we never did that, but a lot of these IDE companies have basically done. And I think that is changing. And I think for any kind of AI product company, you have to be very crisp around what do you think is really special about your data that like a very motivated kind of startup that's like just come out of Y Combinator is going to have a hard time replicating in a synthetic RL environment that can be just sold to these labs and ultimately absorbed into these frontier models, and basically your advantage is gone. And I think there's probably, very likely speaking, there's probably something very valuable. An example I think that's very durable is something like Tab, where it's like knowing when or when not to show like a suggestion is so subtle. It's like this very human feedback kind of thing. Super hard to like synthetically generate this data, I think. And it's the real kind of usage data is such a nice way to capture this very soft, fuzzy distribution. And I think that probably goes even more extreme. Like I think probably in the future, this is a prediction, but in the future, you'll see more model personalization in general, like per user model personalization. And there, I think it's basically impossible, right? You do need that data flywheel. And that's another way that I think application companies that are going direct to their users have that prime position to do that for their customers in a way that like a lab company cannot provide that value directly. But anyways, the long and short of it is I think it's possible. I think it's, in fact, almost probably certain that any product company, there is something real to your data. But if you have to be careful about what it is and not be trying to oversell or overpromise like what you are differentially able to provide versus synthetic data. Because you have to remember synthetic data, you can produce it at scale. It's very clean. Like it does exactly what the data you say it does. And that has to be offset in some kind of meaningful strategic way by the kind of data that you collect, I think.
So something we've been talking around is cost and economics. And the economics of building on top of frontier models, of course, per token is incredibly affordable, right? And the ability of anyone to not have to train a model now and to ping an API and build a prototype is so wild and wonderful. Having said that, as you're scaling a product, costs can blow out incredibly. And with a handful of providers, I'm just wondering how should founders and builders think about build versus buy when it comes to the core AI and thinking about cost?
Yeah, this is a really important question. And it's pretty hard because if you stack up all of the different companies that are providing value in this kind of value chain, right? The hardware layer, the cloud provider, then the model company that's layered on top of the cloud provider, and then you, and every company is trying to build a margin, you're going to be structurally at a disadvantage cost-wise relative to another company that's able to go vertically integrated. And I think maybe you're seeing some of this with like Cloud Code competing with Cursor. And it's not easy. And I think that's why Cursor, for example, they have tried to train their own model. And it's the same reason why at Windsurf, we were really focused on, can we train our own model that is actually respectable, like quite good at the task that we can provide to our users to provide maximum value and daily driver kind of usage to our users in a way that they still feel like they can get value out of our product. And we're not just giving away massive API credits or on the flip side, losing billions of dollars in API costs, net of the subscription revenue that you can generate. So I think, especially if you're in a position where you have a large volume of usage, you have a user base that likes using your product, and there is a path. This is not a trivial thing, but there is a path for you to develop the expertise to train your own model. It always makes sense to be able to do that. At the same time, I've increasingly of the view that it's going to be tough to believe that just being smaller or faster or cheaper is like really going to satisfy your users the next time a brand new model comes out that's like twice as smart as the last one. And so ultimately, I do think these companies are going to be in a position where they always have to build, they're going to be trying to build their own models. At the same time, they're going to have to build capabilities as if it's always state-of-the-art capabilities, because otherwise you run the risk of basically missing the boat on kind of the next frontier, even if you can't serve that with your own models at the right cost. I think you're going to have to do that because it's just the state-of-the-art models are moving forward so quickly, and I think it's only become harder, honestly, to match that performance on a custom fine-tuned model, except unless it's a very niche, very narrow kind of use case.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Having said that, of course, the performance to cost ratios are getting pretty interesting these days. And actually, I'll link to a post by Tomasz Tungus from Theory Ventures, who we had on the podcast recently. But he actually had a wonderful post about the cost and performance of Gemini 3 Flash in particular a couple of days ago. And the cost performance ratio it's mind-blowing how cheap it is with respect to what you get from it compared to any other model out there at the moment.
Yeah, it's an insanely good model. And not only that, but it is a kind of this mantra of actually sometimes fast is really good. And it's just a pleasant model to use, especially if you're trying to do stuff that doesn't require 4 hours of kind of thinking or whatever. Like almost the classic, the original Windsurf kind of coding task, I love to use Flash for that model. But I'm just thinking ahead to just imagine a world in which you are used to using Cloud Code with Opus, and it's able to spin up Kubernetes deployment for you and do debugging for you and analyze the logs and like figure out what's wrong with it and fix it for you and redeploy it again. It's pretty hard to compare that feeling to the feeling of, oh, I could do all of those steps and the AI is helping me do all those steps twice as fast. I think that is the delta that I think I'm not sure exactly how this will play out in the future and whether that kind of gap will always feel like it's the case between true state of the art and like economical price performance. But I do feel like that delta in model size and commensurate model cost is something that users, 10 times out of 10, they vote with their feet and they like tend to prefer that if they can get it.
That makes a lot of sense. But I am interested in a lot of us in our workflows, and I'm sure both of you as well, will choose models based around what we're doing. Also, like when I'm building something, to plan, I'll use a stronger model with reasoning, that type of stuff. And then when I go into execution mode and I want to just write some code, I'll go to a smaller, faster model. Of course, there are some interesting agentic systems like AMP, for example, where they don't even tell you what they're using now. And they'll just do routing based on it. Of course, GPT-5 famously as well started routing, which broke nearly everything I was doing at the time. But I suppose my question for you is, are we seeing products or going to see products where we actually use a variety of different models based upon what our needs are at that point in time? Or are we more thinking one model to just do everything with ease?
Oh, I think almost certainly, if not already. I don't think this is revealing anything secret, but inside of anti-gravity, your main model is probably going to be Gemini Pro, but the browser use model, just because it's trying to do something simpler and you want really fast kind of multimodal understanding and interaction with a GUI, that's going to probably use something like Flash. And that's just a good cost benefit between the speed at which you want to feel like it's using the browser and the intelligence that it needs to do the task. So I certainly think that's already in products today. I certainly think that will become even more the case when now you have a really nice Pareto frontier with almost at every part along that curve, you have a pretty nice model and you can have a real justified use case for a lot of these kind of different model sizes. I think that's definitely true. Yeah.
And also, this is something we've talked around and something Duncan and I have discussed a lot on the podcast and otherwise, but it's really challenging how we all have to like rip out our agent harnesses and all of these things as new models come out. What does this mean for how we produce and develop software these days? It seems like a total paradigm shift, to be honest.
And by ripping out your agent harness, you mean, okay, because this model is like doing something completely different, or what?
Yeah, it's all the tool calls, the way I specified them, the way I tested things. None of this really matters anymore, and it's totally bloated. Ripping them out, having less tools, whatever it may be.
And I think oftentimes the harness may make it worse with the new
Yes.
model when there's better capabilities, right?
Yes.
So actually you're handicapping yourself. And if you're not aggressive enough about ripping it out, you actually may not even see benefit from the new model. And then you're even worse off than you would be in kind of a freer world.
Yeah. So he's absolutely, this has happened to us so many times, as you could probably imagine, where we come to this like slow realization that all this stuff that we have invested so much in is actually making the model do worse at its job. We should just unleash it, unfetter it, and let it flex its wings. So I absolutely believe that's true. At the same time, once you get your head around it, I actually think what it is actually very optimistic, because what it allows you to do is, I think you tend to dream a little bigger. So you're always trying to say to yourself, like, what's still going to be relevant in 6 months, or what's going to be relevant in 6 months that isn't relevant today. So going back to this kind of how we started off at the beginning, if you're preparing yourself for this model to be 50% more capable, 100% more capable in a few months, there's this sort of like bitter lesson, like approach to developing software that actually, when you flip it around, it's like pretty exciting. It's pretty cool because you can just swag a lot of stuff. And the real challenge is, can you dream big enough? Can you dream big enough in a realistic way that anticipates a little bit where the puck is going? And then once that happens, you will feel like so much more magic, and you can actually turn out to swag a lot of stuff and really still achieve really amazing functionality. And that's something that I've really started to try to encourage, even on our research team, just even in our research bets, like the scale of the bet that you can make and the scale of project that you can achieve in like a month is just bigger than it was a year ago. And again, it's scary, but at the same time, if you are primarily excited by or motivated by like kind of the scope of the impact that you can have, which I think is true for a lot of people in our industry, this is just an exciting time. I think it's just like these things are really just there to allow you to achieve your wildest dreams and then just teach you to dream even wilder next time.
Such an exciting time to be building, and so fun, right? You can just try so much so quickly. Many people have thought about this year as like the year of the agent, but it still feels like we're pretty early in that. And maybe it's more of the decade of the agent, as I think others have recently called out. But how do you think about the key differences between this like co-pilot or co-driver, as you called out earlier, era, and like the truer agent era that should be coming?
Yeah, so I think there's a real shift, and going back to the earlier part of our conversation, there's a real shift in mindset when you are no longer, there's like a binary change when you are no longer there watching more or less what the model is doing, and you're really just like going away, completely removing what the model is doing from your context, and you have to come back and like settle back in and realize what this thing was doing. It's like the difference between chat and email you're assigning a project to for a direct report, and you're expecting them to come back maybe in a day or a week or whatever. And I think the reason why decade of agent is correct is because once you pass over that threshold, like the ceiling for that is basically unlimited. Like basically at that point, you're already getting used to the fact that it's going to come back to you and it's going to take you a little bit of time to understand and to grok what they've done and to decide what they need to do next. And whether that is like a day or like a week or a month, it's in many ways like it's still substantively might be the same. So I think we will have a lot of time we will have to take some time to get used to this new paradigm. New tools will have to be developed. I think new evolutions of all the existing product services we're familiar with, or maybe some brand new product services will come along that will be more kind of agent native. And then from there, I think you will see larger and larger horizons of work with potentially more fan out, both like longer in depth and also more fan out in scope to happen. And up to the point where maybe the analogy is like you're maybe a manager managing like 2 or 3 direct reports, and now you have many layers underneath you, and that's scaling. And I have faith that as humans, we will be able to continue to scale our ambitions and our capacity to manage and get value out of like that increasing layers and complexity of and capability of agents for at least quite a while into the future.
As someone actively like working the bleeding edge, I'm curious, like, how do you keep your own ambitions of what is accomplishable today with these tools up to date? Like, how do you make sure that you are aggressively enough delegating to those 2 or 3 reports or starting to build your own like second line team? Just curious if you have a take on that, Nick.
That's a great question. I ask myself that, am I taking advantage of these things enough even today? And I actually think it's gotten to the point where part of my decision on the projects that I try to take on or that my team try to take on at work is literally like, part of this is I can use this as a time to test out this idea I have around how I can use these agents in a different way. It's like partly it's just the information to be gained from trying to implement something. In the same way that maybe earlier in my career, I would take on an infrastructure project just so I could also learn a little bit more about how does Kubernetes work or something like that. That's like part of the value of taking on that project. And I think it's like actively building in part of your value is not just like the work that I'm going to deliver, but like the lessons I'm going to learn in implementing that and taking that into not just your hacking projects, but like your day job. And companies should be empowering their employees to use these tools as much as possible in their day jobs. I think that's going to just have to be part of your workflow. And certainly for us, given that we are developing this thing, it's even more the case that it's part of our job description to like proactively push the limits of what these things are capable of.
Totally. And something Duncan said is, I think it's obvious from this conversation and a lot of the conversations all of us have, but we rarely state explicitly how much fun the space is at the moment and how exciting it is. And that also, especially with the velocity, dare I say, acceleration of developments, that makes it full on as well, right? Like when I get up in the morning, I'm deciding what to do to build my business. All of these things, as all of us are, like sometimes like decision paralysis, it is massive. So I'm just wondering, in such a fun, exciting, fast-moving space, how would you encourage people to think about what to focus on and when to experiment?
Maybe I'll answer this question, the famous analogy that Steve Jobs said, which is I'm building a bicycle for the mind. And I think what that kind of implies is you choose your own adventure and you don't have to like, okay, how am I going to feed back into this self-improvement loop and build this or that thing? I think what we're trying to do is basically build the most capable thing that allows you to stretch your imagination as far as you want it to go or don't want it to go. And I think I've always been amazed and impressed by the people that just follow whims and interests and how important that is actually as a civilization that we have that wide diversity of bizarre takes and weird views on. I would never think to use the tool in some of the ways that people would use it. And I think if you're too pressured into being like, I need to do something productive, like I need to make the next spreadsheet app or whatever, as opposed to just following the kind of where your unique mind and your unique experiences take you. I think that's just, I've tried to learn to follow my own impulses because I cannot help what I am. I cannot help what I am interested in. And when I do that, then the bicycle takes me farther in that direction, allows me to do more and explore more in that direction. And I try not to worry too much about whether that's going to be something that's going to be worth $10 billion or $100 billion like next year.
I love that. And I have 2 responses to that. I'm going to give the slightly spicier one first. It's not that spicy, but firstly, I totally agree. Secondly, I can't imagine you felt that every day at Windsurf, right? Like there were economic pressures you had that I'm sure you got up and you're like, we need to do particular things today, right?
Yes, I think that's always going to be true. Yes, there will always be, we got to do this, we got to implement this thing. But actually, those tend to be the kind of things that's what the Copilot is for. It's just like, okay, I got to whack this thing out or whatever. And that's exactly what it's freeing you up to do. And I will say, and maybe this is a thing, if you are in a startup and it is a matter of maybe sort of financial life or death for you, and you do feel the pressure to like deliver something, I still think, I go back to, this is like an amazing industry to be in because the best way to succeed is to really build something that is aligned with value. And I don't think that's always true. Like, I don't know. You can look at other industries where it's the only reason this business is valuable and exists is because of regulatory capture or because it happens to be able to generate this patent or it's like some small dislocation in the market. But with AI, if you're in this business of developing useful applications out of AI, the market will sniff those things out very quickly. And the only way you can really generate value here is if you do something that's actually useful and means something to somebody. Like somebody can get value out of it. And that's maybe challenging, but it's also maybe that's rewarding because then it just frees you to just focus on like, how can I do useful things, or how can I imagine how the world will be useful next year? And at least for me, that's like very easy to get motivated by. And that's like when I mentioned at the beginning, the practical reality, we couldn't ship a product around this agentic coding, but all the time we could be dreaming about like, how do I make that a little bit feel more like the reality? And that was always, I think, pleasurable because that's what I wanted to see when I joined.
Amazing. And that was, as I said, was my first response, was my slightly more lizard brain, finite game mind. My infinite game mind's response is, I love that you referred to it in Steve Jobs' parlance as a bicycle for the mind. And I'm wondering if we can take it even a step further, that we are building bicycles for the mind, but at the same time, we're building machines that build bicycles for the mind as well. There's this double or triple game where we're not only building thought partners, but we're using them to iterate on themselves and more products in real time. And that's amazing.
Yeah, it's almost like hard to keep track of. I don't know if I can fully imagine what it's going to look like even a year from now to keep track of all these things and to keep track of all the ways that this is feeding back into itself and helping itself. But it's for sure the case. I think many companies will tell you like this has accelerated the pace at which they are able to improve and pursue research ideas and at these AI labs and these kind of agent labs. And I think that trend will probably only accelerate.
Awesome. I think that's it from us. Duncan, are there any final thoughts or questions here?
This is so much fun, Nick.
Yeah.
Thank you for this.
I really enjoyed it, guys. I really appreciate the invite to come on the show and talk to you guys.
Such an absolute pleasure. Awesome.
Thanks so much for listening to High Signal, brought to you by Delphina. If you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to sign up for our newsletter, follow us on YouTube, and share the podcast with your friends and colleagues. Like and subscribe on YouTube and give us 5 stars and a review on iTunes and Spotify. This will help us bring you more of the conversations you love. All the links are in the show notes. We'll catch you next time.